This year we saw a feat that has only happened 5 other times in MLB history, where 2 pitchers have won the Triple Crown in each league in the same season. There have been 39 pitching Triple Crown winners previously, and a Triple Crown, for those of you who don't know, is where you lead a league in all the major stats. For pitchers, it's wins, strikeouts, and ERA. For hitters, it's batting average, home runs, and RBIs. Now, for the hitters, this has only happened 18 times in the 150 years of MLB's existence, with the last one coming in 2012 for Miguel Cabrera that broke a 45-year drought. But today, I want to talk about a man who was on the hunt to be the first one to break that drought 7 years earlier. A player who has become forgotten, it seems, unless you were a Cubs fan and or were in the NL Central. My friends, this is the story of Derrek Lee, the man who almost won the Triple Crown in 2005. Derrek was born September 6, 1975 in Sacramento, California, where he came into the world amongst a baseball family, as both his dad Leon and uncle Lerone were professional ballplayers in Japan, where Lee spent some of his elementary school days growing up, as well as the summer breaks. Ironically though, while growing up of sorts in Japan, he really didn't learn to speak the language much outside of the typical phrases. Lee would go on to graduate from El Camino High School in 1993 and be drafted in the first round, 14th overall, by the San Diego Padres. In his first year in the minors, Lee would spend his time in rookie ball and high A. There he'd post a .296, .380, and .448 slash line, while adding in 3 homers and 15 RBIs. From there, he'd spend the next 2 seasons in high A, where he would continue to grow his potential and really started to add the long ball in finally. And over those 2 seasons, he would rack up 31 home runs while batting near .280. And then in 1996, he would go on to be ranked as the 41st best prospect in baseball, according to Baseball America. Lee would spend the full year in AA, where he would send 34 balls out the yard and then drive in 104. This would only propel him to the 15th spot in all of America in the 1997 preseason rankings of Baseball Americas, but he would see a drop in production as far as counting stats, as he would only hit 13 homers with 65 RBIs. He would also steal 17 bases in 20 attempts and put up his best slash line by far in the minors, posting a .324, .399, .477 slash line. He would go on to be called up for a short stretch early in the 97 season in the majors and would be on the roster once again in the September call-ups, where he would start to shine through. In the last game of the season, he would hit his first career home run in the 11th inning, where he would drive in 3 against San Francisco Giants. They would ultimately win that game. Lee would only play 22 games on the season and for the Padres. That being, as on December 15th, Lee would be moved alongside Steve Hoff and Rafael Medina for one of the best pitchers in the era in Kevin Brown. Now, I will say the Marlins won this trade, but it was only because they were dumping Brown's $4.8 million contract and because Brown only played 1 season in San Diego. However, in that 1 season, the Padres would make it to the World Series, where they would be swept by the then New York Yankees dynasty of the late 90s and early 2000s. Brown would also finish 3rd in Cy Young voting and 22nd in the MVP race that season. Hoff and Medina offered 0 to the team, as Hoff never made the majors, and Medina posted a negative .9 WAR with a 5.69 ERA in 12 starts and 32 games pitched over 2 seasons. As for Lee, well, he'd go on to have a rather up and down first full season with the Marlins. But coming into a doubleheader on July 24th against the Phillies, he had a stat line of .217, .304, and .395 with 10 homers through 98 games. This before going on a really nice run where he would spend almost all of August in the .240 or better mark for batting average, and then would enter September with a slash line of .247, .324, .435. While his first full season wasn't anything crazy, Derrek would end the year with 17 homers and really regressed in his slash line back to .233, .318, and .414. But there were signs of life that he had the ability to be consistent. However, it also showed that he was also able to go on stretches where he would really struggle, like in the next season in 1999, where he would get sent back down to the minors for over half of the season because he was at or below the Mendoza line through May 25th. He would get called back up in September, where he continued to struggle. The contrast from his minor league numbers being that of a slash line of 283, 345, and 516 with 19 homers while driving in 73 runs in just 89 games, where compared to the majors, he was at a 206, 263, 326 slash line with a 5 home runs and only driving in 20 runs. And that was over 70 games, mind you. It was a real concern coming into the 2000 season if he really was the guy and had the potential that they thought he had, or was he just a mirage? Derrek would ultimately make the opening day lineup, however, he would spend most of his time sitting on the bench, where he would only start 5 games through almost all of April. He was very effective though at the plate with an OBP of 475, and then on April 29th, he would get a start against the Dodgers, where he would go on to go 3 for 4 with 2 homers, drive in and score 3 times in a shootout that ended in a 12-13 loss. From there, he'd make 152 more starts and went on to have the season the Marlins really needed. Lee would also end the year with 28 homers while driving in 70 runs. Lee also had a slash line of 281, 366, and 507. And this propelled him to the heart of the lineup as well as becoming a star on a near 500 team. For the next 3 seasons, Lee was a cornerstone piece for the Marlins, where he and Mike Lowell would lead the team in RBIs and homers. On top of that, they would be the anchors of the lineup for a group of youngsters that would come up over the course of the next 3 seasons. And that ultimately led to the magical run in 2003. But before we get to that, let's look at what these 3 seasons looked like. Lee would have a triple slash line of 274, 368, and 492 with an OPS plus of 124. For counting stats, Lee had 79 homers with 253 RBIs, and he'd also add 103 doubles, 13 triples, and managed to steal 44 bases as well. Keep in mind, we're talking about a 6'5", 220 plus pound first baseman. Derrek would also go on to add a WAR of 7.9 to his resume during this time. And in 2003, Lee would get his first Gold Glove and finish 27th in the MVP race. Now, the 91 and 71 2003 Marlins would make the playoffs, as mentioned before, and go on a run where they would beat the Giants and the Cubs in the infamous Steve Bartman series, and then ultimately the Yankees in the World Series. Lee, however, did not have the biggest playoff, as he only hit 1 homer in a 12-3 blowout of the Cubs in Game 2, and would have a pivotal RBI in both Games 6 and 7. Ultimately, this would be Lee's last season with the Marlins, and he would get to leave the Marlins as a top 3 hitter in the young franchise's early days, and is still in the top 10 at worst in most counting stats. On November 25th, 2003, Lee would be traded to the Chicago Cubs for Mike Nannini and Hee-Seop Choi. The funny thing is Lee's dad is the one who scouted and eventually helped get Choi to sign with the Chicago Cubs. After that trade, Choi would have a good first year with the Marlins, but would be traded at the deadline with Brad Penny for Juan Encarnacion and Paul LaDuca, as well as Guillermo Mota. Now, this is a very deep trade tree that I hope Zeke's someday would cover. If you don't know who Zeke's is, he does trade trees on MLB history. Does a great job. Check him out. Now, I would say that on the initial trade, the Cubs easily win. But as the trade tree goes down, you get into Hanley Ramirez and Anibal Sanchez and some others. So you could make an argument the Marlins maybe actually won this trade in the long run. But it's also the Marlins we're talking about, so I doubt it. Back to Lee, who is now 28 and entering his 7th full season and was in his prime, and joining a team that also looked to capitalize on the successes they had the last year but fell short to the Marlins, as mentioned before. The Cubs would go on to have 5 players hit 24 or more homers, and 2 others would add 15 and 16 homers as well. The Cubs would finish 3rd in the majors in homers, and they would also finish 3rd in the Central, even though they won 89 games. Now, with Lee playing in a lineup that was rather stacked with hitters, and with all that talent, he would have his best year of his career thus far, posting a slash line of 278, 356, and 504. He added in 32 homers while driving in 98 runs. Lee also added in 39 doubles, while coming home to score 90 times. He also added a 2.7 to his WAR, which was 8th best on this team. Now, on to 2005, where I personally would become aware of just how good Derrek Lee was. And as a 7th grader who got most of my info from SportsCenter, Baseball Tonight video games, and lastly the collection of SI and ESPN the magazines, back when those were still around. But before we get there, let's look at what each month looked like to get a better frame of mind heading into this season. For April, his slash line was 419, 495, 721 with 6 homers, 28 RBIs, and 8 doubles. May, the slash line of 313, 424, and 646 with 9 homers and 18 RBIs with 5 doubles. June, a slash line of 407, 458, and 713 with 7 homers, 19 RBIs, and 12 doubles. So, coming into July 1st, Lee's totals were a slash line of 379, 457, and 693 with 22 homers, 65 RBIs, and 25 doubles. He was first in average and second in both home runs and RBIs, and tied for first in doubles in the National League. Not only was the Triple Crown in play, but so was a 400 batting average, and then over the next 2 days, he would just add to it, going 5 for 8 with 2 homers and 2 RBIs. Then, on the July 4th edition of the ESPN the magazine, it came out with Lee on the cover with 400, Triple Crown, and MVP on the cover. Unfortunately, this was almost like an omen for what was to come, as the month of July, he would finish with a batting average of 360 and would only continue to fall from there, preventing him from ever hitting the famed 400 mark. But I remember this being the first time that I had ever heard of this feat in baseball, or at least the point of being feasible for a player. And unfortunately, he would only win the batting title, and being the first Cub since Bill Buckner to do so in 1980. During the season, though, Lee would hit his 200th career homer and would finish second in homers and 7th in RBIs. On the season as a whole, for his stats, Lee had his best career season with a slash line of 335, 418, and 662. Lee had an OPS of 174, and he also hit 46 homers, had 107 runs batted in, 120 runs scored, 199 hits, 50 doubles. He stole 15 bases to boot. He also had an offensive WAR of 7.3 and a total WAR of 7.7. He'd get an All-Star nod and a Silver Slugger, first for both of those, and add a Gold Glove and finish third in the MVP race. It was a distant third place. However, I think with the Cubs being below 500 really hurt Lee, as he only got one first place vote. Both Andrew Jones and Albert Pujols were on the top 2 teams in the NL, so you can make an argument that Lee was probably the most valuable player in all of baseball, as he only had Aramis Ramirez and a 36-year-old Jeremy Burnett who provided any other threats in the lineup. By the way, Aramis Ramirez really does deserve a video of his own, and at some point in time, I'll probably look at doing that for a video. 2006 would look to be a great season for Lee, as he would be named to the inaugural WBC as a player for the United States. And then on April 10th, he would sign a 5-year, $65 million deal with the Cubs. Fortunately, 2 weeks in, Lee would break his wrist when he collided with Rafael Furcal and would go on to miss 59 games. He would return for a time, but the wrist would cause him some problems, and he would later return to the IL. And in total, Lee would only get to play 50 games in the season, where he still played at a pretty solid level, all things considered, with a triple slash line of 286, 368, and 474. He only did hit 8 homers in those 50 games and only drove in 30 runs as well, but it was a smaller sample size. Now, healthy in 2007, Lee would claim an All-Star appearance and a Gold Glove. He would lose some of his power, only hitting 22 homers, but he would drive in 82 runs. His ability to get hits and get on base, though, was not lost, as he would have a slash line of 317, 400, and 513. He would also continue to be a consistent threat to put pressure on pitchers, racking up 43 doubles. Lee, now 32, was coming into 2008 hoping to maintain his health and his consistency. While he got off to a slow start, he would go on to have a 21 hit game hitting streak later in the season. This would help him to go on to have a triple slash line of 291, 361, and 462. He'd drive in 90 runs, have 20 homers, and hit 41 doubles. The Cubs would also have some success and would go on to win the Central, but follow the Dodgers in the NLDS in 3 games. Lee would also get some votes for MVP and finish 21st overall in the voting. With that though, there was still some optimism as this team of basically a bunch of 30-year-olds, like literally everybody on the team was 30 years old, was still in their prime and coming off a 97 win season. Lee, being the elder statesman at 33, would turn back the clock and find that sweet spot between his 2004 and 2005 seasons. He was so good that he finished 9th in MVP voting, and he had a slash line of 306, 393, and 579 with 35 home runs, 111 runs batted in, and 36 doubles. This really would be, unfortunately, Lee's last hurrah, as he would basically return to what he had done the last 2 seasons stat-wise, but needless to say, it was nice for the Cub fans to see him have his one last big season. 2010 would mark the last year of his extension that Lee signed in 2006, and would also be his last season in Chicago. Lee would have an interesting June as he would hit his 300th career homer against the Brewers, and then later in the month get into a scuffle with everyone's favorite hothead of the era in Carlos Zambrano after Big Z gave up 4 runs in the first inning. He would blame Lee for missing a hard hit ball on the first base line, and the two would have a scuffle in the dugout, and ultimately Zambrano would go on to be suspended after the altercation. Before the deadline, Lee would be traded to the Angels, but he used his 10-5 rights to veto the trade. For those of you who don't know, 10-5 rights are for players who have spent 10 years in the league and have 5 years with their current team, and they are on and have the right to deny being traded somewhere that they may not want to go. That being said, Derrek would be dealt to the Braves on a waiver trade deal in August, where the Cubs got back 3 players who would never make the majors at all. This was a win-win as Lee was not going to be coming back, and it gave him a chance to go chase a ring with the Braves, who ended the season 91-71. The Braves as a whole would make the playoffs as a wild card team, but they ultimately would go on to lose to the world champion Giants in the NLDS 3-1. But for Lee, he had a solid year, as mentioned before, with 19 homers, 80 RBIs, as well as 35 doubles. His slash line was starting to suffer, though, as I think age was catching up to him, as well as the nagging wrist injuries that he'd had a few years prior, and he only hit 260, which was the second worst of his career. Atlanta, however, would not re-sign Lee either, thus making Lee a free agent for the first time in his career. On January 6th, Lee would sign with the Baltimore Orioles for $7.25 million, where he wasn't very productive and would be traded to the Pirates for a minor leaguer in cash. With the Pirates, Derrek played much better and was an upgrade over Lyle Overbay. However, Derrek would get hit in the wrist again and miss some time, but ended the year strong and almost looking like his old self. And for the year, Lee actually would have a pretty decent season. He'd have a triple slash of 267, 325, 446. He'd hit 19 home runs and drive in 59 to boot. Derrek continued to be able to get extra bases still at 35. He'd have 17 doubles and 2 triples in just 113 games. Lee would go on to retire at the end of the year, but in 2013 the Yankees reached out after Mark Teixeira was injured to fill in, but Derrek Lee decided to decline and stay retired. For his career, Lee's stats looked like the following. He played in 1,942 games. He had a triple slash of 281, 365, and 495. He had 1,959 hits. He'd had 331 homers, 1,078 RBIs, 1,081 runs, 433 doubles, 30 triples, 104 stolen bases. He also had an OPS plus of 122 and was able to accrue 34.6 WAR over the course of his career. Derrek Lee's story doesn't end though with just his career stats. This is a man who started the Project 300 when his daughter was diagnosed with a rare genetic disease known as Leber's congenital aromas. I don't know, I'm going to put it on the screen. which leads to the loss of one's vision. Lee partnered up with the Boston Celtics co-owner and CEO Wyc Grousbeck and the University of Iowa. He would star in a couple of medical dramas to help raise awareness for LCA and even raise more than $1 million for additional research funds. Ironically enough, in 2009, upon a further evaluation, Lee's daughter was found to have been misdiagnosed and never actually have LCA. However, Lee continues to help raise funds to help find a cure for the disease. Derrek and his wife also started the First Touch Foundation in 2005 to help build, support, and encourage educational aspirations for the youth of Sacramento. Lee would unveil a cabaret wine called Derrek Lee, where all proceeds will go to the foundation. Sadly, in 2012, the foundation would close after 7 years. That being said, though, Lee is still an advocate for growing the game of baseball around the world and has visited some African countries as well as Israel to help the youth learn and grow the game that he loves. Well, Derrek Lee is a perfect example of a Hall of Very Good. He had a few seasons where he was in the discussion for the MVP. Lee was also never the best first baseman in the league, as Pujols had that locked in over the course of Derrek's career, but you could argue that he was at least a top 5 to top 10 first baseman every season. And this was back when first base used to be more valued than it is today, as it seems. But I think the 2005 season is and was a historic one that gets overlooked, as he was in a position coming into July as a potential Triple Crown winner and achieving the 400 batting average, and ultimately an MVP-like year. I want to thank everyone who made it this far into this video, and let me know in the comments below, what did you think of Derrek Lee's career? Thanks for watching.